Good day. Today is Sunday, 18th January 2026, and before I proceed with this program, let me remind you again to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel if once you've watched this video or whatever part of the video you want to watch, you decide that you like what you've heard and wish to indicate that fact. Now, I make this program today in a Europe which is, in a sense, in a state of crisis, in a state of shock, of a kind and of a degree that I have never known at any time since I began commentary. Arguably, even before then, I've never known a situation quite like the one that we're in today. Now, over the last couple of days, even as President Trump of the United States has been talking up his demands for the American acquisition of Greenland, the European leadership took what I thought at the time a very strange, deeply eccentric decision, which is to deploy forces to Greenland. They did this apparently without any kind of consultation with Donald Trump, without discussing this with the United States, and so far as I can see, they didn't do it through NATO either. They didn't use NATO, they didn't set up or agree that the force that would be deployed to Greenland would be a NATO force. The numbers of men deployed to Greenland were tiny. Again, there are all kinds of numbers flying around. Some put it as low as 10. That is just 10, the number of fingers on my hands. Others put it higher at around 25. I think that probably the true number was much higher still, and I am going to guess that it's a couple of hundreds altogether. Once the British, who have been reticent about involving themselves in this affair, joined in, though after the events of the last 24 hours, it's far from certain, at least to me, that the British will become involved in this at all. But anyway, a small group of European troops was sent to Greenland. I've already said that I am completely unable to understand what these people were supposed to be doing there. There is in fact no Russian or Chinese threat to Greenland. The Russians have repeatedly said that they have no plans to occupy or take control of Greenland. It is beyond the reach of Chinese power at this time to occupy Greenland. And, well, you only have to imagine what would happen if the Chinese did suddenly send ships into the Arctic to take control of Greenland. You only have to think at that entire scenario to know how preposterous and fantastic it actually is. So there is no actual military threat to Greenland. There are suggestions that the European troops were sent to Greenland in order to deter the Russians and the Chinese. But of course, if the Russians did have real plans against Greenland, the size of this force would not have deterred them. It would have convinced them that they could roll over Greenland without any difficulty, which, by the way, they probably could do if they had the plan to do so. Obviously, in the event that they were to do that, they would be making an attack on a NATO country, Denmark. Article 5 of the Washington Treaty would come into effect. The United States would undoubtedly take immediate action. Any Russian force invading Greenland would be rapidly and completely destroyed. And, well, Russia would, at that point, either face the choice of being completely humiliated over a territory that is of no importance to them, or it would have to decide whether to go to war, to start World War III, over, again, a territory that is of no interest or importance to them. I go through these ridiculous scenarios simply to expose how absurd they really are. So, deploying a small number of European troops to Greenland without consulting NATO, without doing it through NATO, without informing the United States, without consulting and agreeing this deployment with the United States, if it really was directed at the Russians and the Chinese, made absolutely no sense at all. If, however, it was intended as some kind of deterrent action against the United States, if it was supposed to be some great act of solidarity with Denmark, then the folly of this move was even greater, because Donald Trump was certain to be infuriated by it. The Americans in general were always going to react negatively to a deployment of even token numbers of troops intended to deter them, all the more so given that they are far and away the dominant partner within NATO and the country which is involved in securing Europe's security, assuming, of course, that Europe even needs American protection. I'm not going to discuss that in this program. Anyway, it was an absurd thing to do. And again, sending 10, 20, 25, 50, 100, 500 troops to Greenland was never going to deter the United States. It was going to provoke it. It was far more likely to provoke it than it was to deter it. And anyway, the whole idea of military deterrence by the Europeans against the United States is, as anyone who is aware of the military realities in Europe, it was anyway completely and entirely misconceived. So, of course, what it did, predictably, is that it produced the very reaction that one might have expected. Donald Trump was infuriated. He published a whole series of eviscerating, furious comments. He has slapped 10% tariffs on the European Union over and above the tariffs that he has already imposed. So the European Union is now paying, as I understand it, 25% tariffs for the goods it exports to the United States. And Britain, which just a few weeks ago was congratulating itself on limiting the tariffs that the Americans would impose on British goods being exported to the United States to just 10%, well, it now faces 20% tariffs because it too has been included amongst the countries that are facing these tariffs that are coming from the United States. And Donald Trump has now gone on to say that the tariffs will remain in place until some mechanism is agreed or found or decided by him, whereby Greenland will be transferred in its entirety to the United States. And moreover, he's gone further than this because he says that if that has not happened by the 1st of June of this year, then he's going to raise the tariffs further still. We're going to get 25% tariffs. I don't know, by the way, whether this is 25% tariffs above the additional 10% tariffs that he has just imposed. I'm not sure that Trump himself knows. But anyway, the fact is that the tariff war against Europe is tightening. And, well, the Europeans are in a state of shock and dismay. There's lots of comments, lots of criticisms about how these actions are deeply unfriendly. Ursula von der Leyen is again saying that this is an attack on sovereignty and territorial integrity, and this is something that Europe apparently takes very seriously. Kaja Kallas has published comments about how China and Russia must be delighted by these acts which demonstrate NATO Western disunity. Again, why bring China and Russia into this issue? I simply don't understand. I would have thought that it would be better for Kaja Kallas, given that, as I said, that there is no Russian threat to Greenland, and the idea of a Chinese threat to Greenland is so fantastic that it belongs in the wilder realms of fiction. Anyway, why Kaja Kallas wants to bring up Russia and China all over again, to my mind, it basically demonstrates once again what her underlying fixation really is. Russia mostly, China a little, and that she's somebody who wants to preserve the alliance with the United States at practically any price. And she does so because, as a Baltic politician, she senses deep down that after the way in which the Baltic states have massively mismanaged their relations with Russia, the only security that the Baltics still have now is through preservation of the alliance with the United States. Anyway, there have been all sorts of extraordinary comments floating around that NATO itself is on the brink of collapse. There's an article in The Economist which says that there is talk in Europe that the retaliatory action the Europeans are going to take, or might decide to take, is to close down the American bases in Europe. Can I say straight away that, as somebody who on balance would want to see the American bases go and would not shed many tears if they did, I think that for this bunch of European politicians, this is an extraordinarily dangerous game to play. Not only would such a move indeed probably lead to the collapse of NATO, I personally might not be sorry about that, but I would have thought that European politicians who've staked so much in NATO would be. But if the Europeans were unwise enough, reckless enough to take a step like that, then they need to understand that in an all-out confrontation with the United States, which a move of that kind would probably lead to, it is the United States that has all the high cards. The United States imports goods from Europe, so there has been historically a deficit in goods in Europe's favour. I accept that if we add services and other things, then the Americans have the advantage, or may have an advantage there. But Trump personally is mostly focused on trade in goods. The US can take other steps in terms of security. They can end intelligence assistance. They can say that since the Europeans have cut themselves off from the United States by closing the bases, the United States has no further interest in NATO and in the Washington Treaty, and it might move to rescind it. One can certainly imagine those scenarios. But in a game of such escalation, it seems to me that there are other things that the Americans could do which would have an immediate effect, which would not involve security issues, and which would almost certainly, if pushed, lead to a major crisis in Europe and probably a humiliating European climb down. Now, I hesitate to float ideas which some people in Washington might pick up. But then again, I can't imagine that any ideas that I have, that someone like me has, would not be known already by people in Washington. There is one thing that the United States could do immediately, which would have a catastrophic effect in Europe, and it's very simple. It could stop LNG deliveries. Now, it's perhaps worth pointing out that it's only relatively recently that the United States has become a major exporter of LNG. And of course, the big exports by the United States of LNG to Europe have happened since 2022. They have been highly profitable to the United States. They have not, by the way, made up the difference in the shortfall of pipeline gas from Russia. The only reason why the Europeans up to now have been able to keep the lights on is because so much of their industry has closed. Just saying. But anyway, the European decision to stop importing pipeline gas from Russia, which was made in 2022 and has been steadily enforced, and the further European decision made last year to stop importing LNG from Russia as well, means that Europe today overwhelmingly depends on LNG imports from the United States. There are LNG imports from Qatar as well. They are not capable by themselves of replacing or substituting for a cut-off of LNG imports from the United States. Frankly, that idea is ridiculous, and would the Emir of Qatar and his officials decide to undermine American decisions by ramping up exports of LNG to Europe in order to undercut the United States at the wish of the Europeans, given that Qatar hosts a massive American base and relies heavily on the United States for security? I would guess not. Just saying. So what happens if the United States were to cut off supplies of LNG? It's difficult to say. Would the Europeans reverse their sanctions on Russia? Would they come along to Moscow and say, we need to import your pipeline gas again because we're not getting LNG from the United States? What would the Russians say in response? What if they say no, as they might quite easily do? Just say, if the Russians won't supply pipeline gas, and if after the extraordinary escalation by the Europeans of cutting down the bases in Europe, the Americans were to make such a move, given that we're at a time when European gas reserves are at lower than usual levels, not critically low levels, but lower than usual levels, given all the problems we've had with energy in Europe over the last 4 years. Well, I'm not even going to try to imagine what the effect on the European economy would be if the Americans were to take a decision like that. Now, exploring this even further, you can see the extent of the folly of the European leaderships. First of all, there is no possible military pushback from the Europeans against the United States. Even when European armies were far more powerful than they are today, say in the 1970s or 1980s, the idea of the Europeans taking on the Americans in military terms would have been fantastic. The idea of sending European troops to Greenland in order to deter the Americans is fantastic now, even more fantastic now, but it would never have been a wise option at any time, at least I would say since the 1960s, perhaps even before. So that's the first observation to make. But that doesn't change the fact that Europe has, over the last 30 years, given away all of its cards. The European economies are in a terrible state. Europe has utterly failed to keep up with the Americans in any major technological sector. There are no big European social media companies. The Russians have social media companies analogous to every one that the Americans have. China, of course, also does. No European country has been able to set up European platforms or social media companies. In the area of advanced chip development, the Europeans are not present. In all sorts of other sectors, Europe is now falling behind the Americans, the United States. It's falling behind China. It's falling behind Russia too, by the way. A fact which people in Europe are very unwilling to acknowledge, but there is no doubt about this. I mean, in a year's time, the Russians claim they will start to get their Starlink, their own equivalent to Starlink, up and running. Maybe that's ambitious. Maybe it's not going to happen next year or even the year after. Maybe it will take a little longer than the Russians say, but the Russians will get there in the end. And they have now a burgeoning civil aviation sector and a military aviation sector. And of course, the Europeans have none of that. So the Europeans, their economies have been falling behind. Their technological base has been falling behind. They have completely messed up their energy situation. They had 10 years ago a stable, secure energy position. I remember there was a lot of talk at that time about energy security. I would argue that the Europeans had it. They had cheap, reliable Russian gas flowing from Russia. It is untrue that the Russians ever threatened to switch off gas to Europe in order to extract political concessions. They didn't do that after the 2014 Maidan crisis in Ukraine. Russian gas continued to flow. There had been two brief gas wars in 2006 and 2009, but both had been with Ukraine, and both were on the specific issue of pricing, and both were resolved very quickly. It is not true that it was the Russians who switched off the pipes in 2022, even though there are German politicians like Olaf Scholz who have claimed this. So there was a reliable transfer of gas from Russia to Europe, a trade that had continued for decades uninterrupted, which began during the Cold War and which was indeed initiated in the 1960s. I would add, and it's a point I've made many times, that it would have made absolutely no sense, politically or economically, for the Russians to stop supplies of gas to Europe in order to extract political concessions. Doing such a thing would have created a crisis between Russia and Europe and would have destroyed trust in the Russian gas export trade, not just with Europe, but with pretty much anyone, China included, and that would have made no sense for the Russians to do. So it never happened. So the Europeans had this reliable supply of gas from the Russians, and the key thing to say is that it never amounted to total energy dependence, as has so often been said. At its maximum, Russia was exporting around 40% of Europe's gas needs, but there were always options to increase gas supplies from other sources, from Algeria, from Qatar, from the United States, or from whoever, thereby ensuring a stable situation with gas in Europe. And of course the Europeans could have developed their own energy resources. I'm not going to get into the whole vexed topic of Europe's nuclear power industry and what has become of it. But anyway, that's perhaps a sad topic, better left for another time. Suffice to say that as a result of a series of catastrophic decisions, which culminated in the appalling decisions made since February 2022, we now have a situation where the Europeans are dependent on energy upon the United States. And not just on energy, for so much else, for intelligence, for protection, for operation of their social media platforms, for technology development, for so many things. If there is a prolonged row between the Europeans and the Americans, nobody should be in any doubt as to who ultimately will win the argument. The only thing that might tilt the balance in the other direction is if this issue is used in the United States by Donald Trump's opponents against him, this issue of Greenland. But I have to say that it seems to me equally likely that in the United States, Greenland might, depending on the scale of the European reaction, become a consolidating issue. And, well, I'm not familiar with the situation in the United States. I get the sense that increasing numbers of Americans are perhaps less than enthusiastic about the continued commitment to Europe. Americans, in my experience, when the United States gets into a quarrel with another country, tend axiomatically to support the United States and assume that it is the other country or group of countries that are in the wrong. And, well, I would not count on Donald Trump's domestic enemies being able to use this issue domestically against him in a way that would make a difference. Now, here I'm going to say something else. I think the Europeans completely underestimated the extent to which Donald Trump himself is obsessed with Greenland. Something very similar happened last year over tariffs. We said several times, Alex Christoforou and I, on the Duran, then when Trump was talking about tariffs and protectionism, he was serious about it. He absolutely was intending to impose tariffs. he was extremely angry with himself for not imposing tariffs during his first term. He has, as he always does, imposed tariffs in a completely eccentric, chaotic, and incoherent way. You can argue that many of the tariffs serve no sensible purpose. You can argue, as Professor Sachs, Jeffrey Sachs, eloquently does, that the entire case for imposing tariffs is fundamentally wrong and that it is based on a whole series of economic misconceptions, which mean that the policy will end in time in making the economic situation within the United States worse. And you can also argue, as we on the Duran have done, Alex Christoforou and me, that at some point Donald Trump muddled up and mixed up his tariff policy, which ought to be an economic policy, with his sanctions policy, which is a geopolitical policy, not only muddling the rationale for imposing tariffs, but perhaps undermining his legal position in the battle with the Supreme Court, that over tariffs that he has now been fighting. But the point is, you can make all of these points, and they're entirely valid points, but they don't obscure the key fact that Donald Trump was serious about tariffs and was going to impose them. Also, the same is true about Greenland. I remember last year when Trump first started to talk about Greenland, nobody, as far as I could see, in Europe took him seriously. They were all focused on Ukraine. They had these nightmares that Trump and Putin would in some way get together and decide the whole issue of Ukraine without Europe. They remained utterly and even obsessively committed to their duel with Russia. Their entire priority was to keep Trump alongside in the hope that he would eventually turn on the Russians and support the Europeans in the Europeans' obsessive, eccentric, suicidal, utterly self-defeating quest to take on the Russians, not just over Ukraine, but in everything else. So, as a result, they stopped thinking or worrying about Greenland. One of the people who stopped doing so, who didn't really think about Greenland, was the Danish Prime Minister, Prime Minister Frederiksen. She spent hours, huge amounts of time, talking about Russia, about the threat of Russia. There's been ideas floating around on closing the Danish straits to merchant ships that trade with Russia. By the way, the Russian ambassador to Denmark has recently discussed this. He says that there is no legal way of closing the Danish straits because the free navigation through the Danish straits is provided for by international treaty. It is in some ways, I presume, rather like the Dardanelles that separate the Mediterranean from the Black Sea. And I believe that is right. I remember reading some time ago that there is actually an international treaty that safeguards navigation through the Danish Straits. Russia is a signatory, and so, of course, is Denmark. So there is no legal mechanism for closing the Danish Straits. But, nonetheless, and of course, there's been much talk and discussion about finding other legal pretexts to try to stop Russian ships, claim that they're launching drones, and that these drones are the drones that are flying over airports in Copenhagen, in such places, claim that they're engaged in sabotage of undersea cables, claim all kinds of fantastic and improbable things. Of course, there's been many such claims over the last few months, not a single shred, well, hardly any evidence, no real convincing evidence has ever been produced, but there's been a great deal of that floating around. And again, as the Russian ambassador to Denmark has said, though the Danes have no legal grounds to close the Danish straits, it remains the case that the Europeans have Russian ships traveling through the Danish straits in their sights. And the Russians have increasingly been taking precautions, have been preparing for the day when they might have to defend them, using their navy and their very powerful air force, which is very strong in the Baltics, to do so. By the way, on this topic, I should say that I am going to push back against an article that I read by Anatol Lieven. He said that the Russian Navy is in a weak position, it's a weak navy, and that the Russians don't have the ground forces to make a commitment to the Baltics, in the Baltics, because the Russian army is mostly committed to the war in Ukraine. I think this is a major misunderstanding of the military balance. If we're talking about the Arctic, the North Sea, and the Danish Straits, the Russian Navy, though obviously nowhere near the size of the American Navy, is certainly a force to be reckoned with in all of these places, even relative to what the Americans can deploy. But of course, we would not be dealing just with the Russian Navy. There is the Russian Air Force, there is the Russian missile forces with their new Oreshnik missiles and all of the other types of missiles. And as for ground forces, it is simply not true that the Russians have no ground forces that they could deploy in the Baltic, because much of the Russian army continues to be in Russia. That is where all the reserve armies are, and they could certainly intervene in the Baltic at the present time. Just saying. But anyway, my point is that Friedrichsen has been thinking and talking about all of these things. She's been agitating for more sanctions against Russia. She has been very, very instrumental in mobilizing support in Northern Europe and indeed in Europe as a whole against Russia. She has axiomatically assumed an alliance, the continuation, the preservation of the alliance with the United States. And of course, in these policies, these misguided policies, she shares the attitudes of all of the other Scandinavian governments and of the Baltic states. And, well, she, my sense is, never really believed that a crisis with the Americans over Greenland would ever arise. So she never prioritized that. She never thought what might need to be done in order to navigate this challenge, if it ever came. She might have come up with all kinds of solutions. She could have, for example, decided to move forward with a Greenland referendum on independence. Apparently there's much debate in Greenland about doing this. Supposedly there's been talk about doing this. A referendum might have been organized in Greenland last year, whilst Trump was still immersed and distracted with other matters. to try to sort out the future legal relationship with Greenland, and she could have done all of that in consultation with the United States. She could have done other things in consultation with the United States too, and with the other European allies, prioritizing, as I said, the issue of Greenland. And of course, most important of all, she could have, given that there was this looming crisis over Greenland coming, she could have revisited the issue of whether quarreling with the Russians was really such a good idea after all. Perhaps maintaining some contact with the Russians, maybe seeking diplomacy with the Russians, maybe taking steps, serious steps, to end the crisis in Ukraine, leaving Europe in a better position, and leaving Denmark in a much better position, would have been the right thing. She could have advocated for it, but of course she never did. There's a famous quote of Bismarck's in which he said that if he had to play chess, he would only do so if he could play on all 64 spaces on the chessboard. Well, the Europeans, Prime Minister Fredriksson, never did that, because some of the most important places on the chessboard, the Russian ones, she was not prepared to play on. And, well, there we are. That is, now they face this crisis and they have no plan, no serious idea what to do. Their microscopic deployment to Greenland, the one which provoked Donald Trump, was perhaps the proof that they have no real plan, no real idea, no conception of where to go. Now, at this point, perhaps I should set out my own views, my own position about this. It's very close to certain comments made on Sonar 21 by Larry Johnson. I do see no grounds for the United States to seize Greenland. To me, this looks like an aggressive, expansionist, predatory act. It's certainly contrary to international law and to all accepted rules of behavior, the way in which the Americans are behaving. I am less shocked by it than some people in Europe are, for one very simple reason. And that is that what is happening now is no different from so much of what the Americans have been doing around the world for so long. Admittedly, since the Second World War, the Americans have not simply come along and annexed territory, seized territory and conquered territory in the way that they might do now in the case of Greenland. But pretty much everything else that, as in my textbook, constitutes aggression. Military actions against countries that are not threatening them, massive interference in their internal affairs, coercive sanctions, all of those things they have done. And the Europeans, of course, have been a party to all of this. They have either cheered it along, or they have aided and abetted in it. The last instance where there were some flickers of European opposition came back in 2002, 2003, when France and Germany opposed George W. Bush and Tony Blair's plan to invade Iraq. But even then, the Europeans were not able or capable of doing very much. And it is fair to say that even in Germany and France at that time, there were many, many voices that advocated support for the Americans in that ill-starred enterprise. Since then, of course, all discordant, dissident voices have disappeared. And if we talk about Britain, the British political elite has become, if anything, even more enthusiastic about joining in American regime change wars and American expeditionary forces to all sorts of places, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, wherever you want, than they were previously. The British have barely said anything about the Venezuela affair. Of course, in the past, they supported the previous eccentric decision of the Americans to recognize Mr. Guaido as the president of Venezuela, when of course he wasn't even in the country. Anyway, they helped themselves, or rather they froze Venezuela's gold reserves. And most recently, the British cheered themselves on as they assisted the Americans to seize the Marinera tanker, the old creaking, rusty supertanker, or not supertanker, old tanker, Shadow Fleet tanker, which was trying to escape to Russia and had painted on its hull the Russian flag. The British Defence Secretary, John Healey, was crowing about how the British had assisted the Americans in that enterprise, which, to say it again, I personally consider completely illegal. Seizing ships in the high seas in that way, to my mind, makes no sense at all, legal sense at all, even if it is done in execution of sanctions, an economic blockade on Venezuela, which I, by the way, also consider to be illegal. Just saying. Anyway, the British were crowing about it, and they were telling each other, and it was all over the media here, the BBC was talking about it, that they might even go further and start themselves seizing Russian flagships on the high seas. And now, suddenly, to their horror, having aided, abetted, colluded, complied with all of this American behavior all around the world, this neocon behavior all around the world, suddenly, to their shock and horror, they find that the Americans are treating them, the Europeans, in the same way that they have been treating everyone else. So I personally am not shocked by this, because deep down I always assumed that the day would come when it would happen. The Europeans, for some reason, never thought they did. They thought that they could happily swim along in the wake of American power, disregarding all of the various American moves to tear up pretty much every known convention and principle of international law. They went along with the fiction about the rules-based international order and all of that. And now, shock, horror, they find that the Americans are treating them in exactly the same way as they have treated everyone else. Well, there it is. There's a famous passage in a play about Thomas More that was published in the 1960s in Britain and which was converted into a film, in which somebody says that he would cut down every law in order to get all the way to the devil. And Thomas More says, and when the devil turns round and faces you, and all the laws have been cut away, where will you hide? Well, I'm not saying that the United States is the devil, far from it, by the way. But can one not see that having colluded with the Americans in the effective disruption of international law over the last 30, 40, 50 years, the Europeans now find themselves in something like that position? They're busy wringing their hands, telling themselves it's the end of NATO. What can we do? They're coming up with fantastic ideas like closing down American bases and all of those things, even though their total dependence on the United States is there for all to see. They brought this calamity on themselves, and for what it's worth, whatever happens to Greenland from this point on, I suspect it will continue to get worse. Now, having said all of this, this is what I think is going to happen. I think the Europeans are going to try in some way to find some mechanism to give Trump what he wants. An American official is apparently traveling to Europe in March, and there's going to be discussions about Greenland, and Trump has made it absolutely clear that he wants Greenland to be handed over to the United States. You can absolutely properly go through all of his fantastic arguments about Greenland, pointing out how wrong each and every one of these is. That is not going to change Donald Trump. He wants Greenland and he's going to get it. And there is really no arguing with this. So, some way or other, the Europeans are going to have to give him Greenland, because they're not going to take on straight on the United States in the way that they pretend they are. They're not going to close down the American bases. They're not going to let themselves be catapulted into an economic war with the Americans, which they are not only going to lose, but which they are going to catastrophically lose if it ever happens. So they know this, and they are going to have to accept this, and over the next few weeks and months, they're going to have to give Donald Trump what he wants. This is very bad, but it might not be a total disaster for Europe. It would be a tragedy for the 57,000 people who live in Greenland, who would see their aspiration for Greenland to become an independent country indefinitely thwarted. And it's sad that so few people seem to think about them. But for Europe, if Europe learns the lessons from this affair, well, then there might be a way forward. These mumbled words about talking to the Russians, well, that obviously ought to be a priority. Coming to terms with the Russians is essential in order to reduce dependence on the United States. If you have good terms with Russia, then you have pipeline gas coming perhaps coming back again. You might also be in a stronger position then to say, from a security point of view, that we don't need these American bases, and maybe the moment has come for the Americans to leave. We might not even need all of the intelligence cooperation with the Americans that we have previously had. I don't myself believe that a severance with the Russians is ever going to with the Americans, is ever really going to happen. I ought to quickly say that if the Europeans were to decide to actually take steps against American bases, there would be no unity in Europe about this. I suspect there would be strong opposition within Germany. I can't imagine the British doing it. And let's assume that the Germans and the British did do it. I think you would quickly find that other European countries, the Poles, the Balts, Italy, under its present government, would quickly renegotiate with the United States terms allowing for the United States to open alternative bases there. So I don't myself think that there is any scenario in which the connection with Europe, between Europe and the United States, will be severed. But if the Europeans play their cards wisely over the next few years, try to repair at least some of the damage they have done to themselves, work out a relationship with the Russians, work out relations with other countries too. China, for example, India too, BRICS altogether, just saying. Then Europe would be in a much stronger position. And if the Americans come again, if Donald Trump or a future president says, well, Greenland is good, but I want Iceland too, well, then at that point, the Europeans would be in a much stronger position to say no. Now, saying all of that, I'm going to say what I think. I don't think the Europeans are going to do any one of these things. I was reading in the Financial Times that the chairman of the Latvian central bank, as I understand it, by the way, Latvia is in the Eurozone. I might be wrong here. In which case, the Latvian central bank probably doesn't have very much to do, just saying. But anyway, the chairman of the Latvian central bank is busy reminding us all that Europe is already at war, in effect, with Russia. So, of course, we can't possibly make up with the Russians. We must continue with the same exhausted, disastrous policies that we have been following for the last 20 plus years, and especially over the last 4 years. And that must mean that we must make up with the Americans and give them always whatever they want. Go on appeasing them. So yes, we're going to give them Greenland because we must, but before long, if they come asking for Iceland, well, we can give them that too. That, I'm afraid, is the reality. That, I suspect, is what is coming. Because unlike Bismarck, the current leaders of Europe won't insist on playing chess on every space on the chessboard. They will continue to deny themselves the most important ones. Anyway, this is an interesting affair. It's, in some ways, I think, more about Europe in the end than it is about the United States. And of course, as a European, I am setting out a European perspective. Anyway, we will see where it all goes. Now, I will now turn to the situation again in Ukraine. And the first thing to say is that the energy crisis, which is already catastrophic in Ukraine, looks like it's going to become more catastrophic still. The Ukrainians are still expecting the next big Russian missile and drone strike. My own sense is that the Russians are playing a very cruel game with the Ukrainians. They are aware that the Ukrainians are basically on the floor in terms of energy, of their energy situation. As I understand it, the energy situation in Kiev is actually getting worse, despite the fact that we don't have major missile strikes taking place against Kiev at the moment. The Russians do, however, continue to conduct drone attacks with Geran drones around 250 ground drones were launched against Ukraine last night. And despite Ukrainian claims that they have developed effective means to counter the ground drones, they recently released footage of one of their interceptor drones shooting down a ground drone. Of course, we don't know how often this happens. But anyway, despite that, I noticed that even the Ukrainians admitted that around 100 of these ground drones still got through. And most of them seem to be attacking electricity substations across Ukraine, worsening the situation. But the Russians continue to play the cruel game of keeping the Ukrainians worrying and guessing about when the next big, devastating missile strike, the one with possibly the new hypersonic missiles, which are said to be in production and coming into service, the one with the Oreshnik missile, when exactly that is going to happen. On the topic of the Oreshnik missile, the exceptionally interesting YouTube channel, Millennium 7, did another very interesting discussion of the Oreshnik strike on the aircraft repair plant in Lvov. By the way, I noticed with some surprise that the host of this channel was unaware of the fact that the Russians have actually identified the target as this aircraft repair plant near Lvov. He still said that there was doubts about the target. He didn't seem to know that the Russian Defense Ministry has already identified it. And anyway, but nonetheless, I found this a most interesting discussion altogether. He discussed both the character of the Oreshnik. He too seemed to think that this is more a saturation strike than a deep penetration weapon, not one, in other words, to be used to attack bunkers. And he also argued against the theory that the attack on Lvov was carried out with unitary warheads. He also seemed to think that it was similar to the strike on the Yuzhmash factory in November 2024, which was carried out by basically cluster rounds. Anyway, all of that was very, very interesting. And he did nonetheless say that whatever damage the Oreshnik did, it was undoubtedly real, and that the Ukrainians have been unwilling to provide any information about the damage on the Yuzhmash factory, and he expects that they will do the same with the Lvov factory, and that satellite pictures of the Yuzhmash factory were unavailable for a long time after the Oreshnik attack, and that he has doubts that the ones that did eventually appear were real, and he says that he expects the same to be the case with the attack on the Lvov factory also. All of that was very interesting, and I would suggest that people who are interested in this topic might want to go and watch that program on Millennium 7. What I would say, the thing that really left me gasping was he said that the Oreshnik would be a relatively easy missile system, weapon system to mass produce in quantity, and that according to sources, the cost of each individual missile is around $3 million. I mean, if that is true, if those claims are true, then I have to revisit my previous skepticism about the suggestion that the Russians can produce 25 of these missiles a month. They perhaps can and will and maybe are already doing so, in which case there is a significant quantity of these missiles already there, and they could be used against air bases, energy facilities, railway stations, workshops, warehouses. I mean, it would be a devastating saturation weapon to use in that way. He suggested that his concept of an Oreshnik strike would be comparable, the strike effect would be comparable to a strike on one target by 24 Tomahawk missiles. So that perhaps gives us some idea. But anyway, the Russians, as I said, are still playing this cruel game with the Ukrainians, waiting, preparing for the moment when the next big strike comes. Apparently they're still moving aircraft into position. They're still busy preparing. Everybody assumes, I've no doubt that this is true in fact, that big stockpiles of Geran drones have been built up, and it could be that an enormous strike on a scale we've never seen before, perhaps using new weapons with Oreshnik missiles also being used, that such a vast, colossal strike is coming. Certainly the Ukrainians seem to think so. Zelensky and his officials were saying yesterday that they believe that the Russians are now preparing to attack the electricity substations that channel electric power from Ukraine's nuclear power stations, which would in effect interrupt or end all further electricity supply to Kiev whatsoever, effectively rendering the city completely uninhabitable. Again, of course, I don't know to what extent this is true, but that at least is what the Ukrainians are saying. And already the situation in Kiev, which is almost now, or large sections of which now seem to be in permanent blackout, is getting worse all the time. I'm starting to see, by the way, pictures of pipes, freezing pipes in apartment buildings, which of course does huge damage in itself. And there was a really rather desperate and, I thought, distressing scene of people trying to keep warm by burning old Christmas trees. Just saying. In Kharkiv, the situation appears to be even worse. There doesn't seem to be any electric power to the city at all, and the Russians continue to tighten their grip on Kharkiv. The Russians yesterday released extraordinarily evocative, powerful drone footage of their destruction using drones of the Patriot missile system that has been providing air defense to Kharkiv. The Russians identified it, they found out where it was, and you see the Erector vehicles with the Patriot missiles and the radar stations across this snowy landscape, and you see the drones homing in on them and destroying them, as I said, across this landscape. So the situation in energy terms is catastrophic, and, well, the worry, the fear that this big strike is coming, well, that is causing nerves to be on edge right across Ukraine including on Zelensky's part and on the part of his officials. I would add that, of course, it's not just Kharkiv and Kiev that are in this terrible situation. Dnipro apparently is also, and Odessa, the situation in Odessa seems to be as bad as it is in Kharkiv. So it's many cities now across Ukraine. Now, I'm going to make my own observation about this. I remember an article that was published by John Helmer on his website Dancing with Bears way back in the autumn of 2022, when the Russians first began what Helmer calls the electricity war. And in this article, Helmer quoted an American expert that he had contacted with, and this expert told him that he didn't think that the Russians at that time, we're talking about the autumn of 2022, were seeking to knock out the entire Ukrainian energy system. Rather, they were working out the features of this system so that they would know how to knock it out in the event of, at the time, when the time came for the Russians to mount their major offensive at the end that would end the war. Now, I've mentioned this article several times and I've had some pushback, and several people have pointed out absolutely correctly that since the Ukrainian energy system was created by the Soviet Union, all the plans and all the information about it would have been available to the Russians already. The Russians would have known everything. They would have known where the power stations were, where the substations were. They would have known everything about it. And I understand that before 2014, and to some extent even after 2014, it was the Russians who provided the spare parts to keep some parts of the system still operational. And it seems as if there's been no major update of the system since the time of the Soviet collapse. However, I don't think this completely refutes the point that Helmer was making, because it seems to me that even if the Russians knew everything there was to know about the system itself, they might not have known in the autumn of 2022 what resources were needed to shut it all down. And they might not have had those resources in the autumn of 2022 to shut it all down. So they could have been probing the system in order basically to understand not how the system worked, but what they needed to do. And could it be, just a question now, that if the Oreshnik is as cheap and as straightforward to build as the commentator on Millennium 7 is saying, using concepts and technologies that the Russians and before then the Soviets had developed over many years, and production facilities that are already in place, could it be that the design work on the Oreshnik began as recently as the autumn of 2022, and that development of this very powerful weapon system has taken place in just 3+ years? Knowing a little about the Russian defense and technology complex, and knowing also its history, especially during the Second World War, I have to say that if that was the case, it wouldn't completely surprise me. Anyway, coming back to my main point, could it be, going back to Helmer's article, that the fact that the Russians are now in the process of closing down Ukraine's energy system, because this is what it is increasingly looking like, that they are taking the first steps to empty the cities and to stop movement of the railways. And railway trains are now regularly attacked and destroyed. And of course, the railway system historically in Ukraine relies on electric traction. Could it be that this means that the Russians are indeed working towards the big offensive using the reserve armies in the rear, which is intended to end the war? I did think to myself that for the first time, what the Russians are doing in Ukraine is starting to remind me of the month-long air campaign that the United States waged against Saddam Hussein's Iraq before the ground operation in Kuwait and Iraq began in 1991. Just so. So, could it be that everything is now working up to that? Well, of course, I don't know. And to repeat again, the Russian General Staff does not share its plans with me. But you could argue that we are now getting closer to that point. There's been earlier moments when it looked as if the Russians were indeed about to launch this great offensive. Many people thought that they would do so in February and March 2022, but in fact they didn't. And as has been explained many times by many people, the actual Russian invasion force that entered Ukraine in February 2022 was rather small, perhaps 130,000 men, far fewer than the million or so troops that participated in the operations that the United States conducted against Saddam Hussein's Iraq in 1991. And I remember thinking back in the autumn of 2022 that maybe the Russians would start a big offensive in the autumn of 2022-2023. But again, it didn't happen. And in fact, the Russians, very wisely, as it turned out, prioritized creating their own defenses, the so-called Surovikin line, in order to counter the Ukrainian offensive, which instead came in the summer of 2023. Just saying. But maybe, given what we are seeing play out now, maybe we are in the weeks or months in the preparatory stages of the knockout blow that might finally end the war in 2022. That we've now reached the point when the Russians have the forces available, the reserve armies, where the Ukrainian army has been sufficiently weakened on the front lines, where it looks like Donbass is now within distance of falling, and where the Russians in Zaporozhye region are approaching the city of Zaporozhye and therefore the Dnieper in its central places. Whether perhaps the moment perhaps hasn't quite come, but is approaching, when the Russians are going to finally bring down the fist. Might not that operation that took place some weeks ago, the attack on the Dnieper bridge in Dnipro, the use of something like 20 Geran drones to close the bridge, which was successfully achieved for several days, might that not also have been, as well as an attack on a particular target, a dress rehearsal for that kind of massive operation which might be coming? I want to stress that this is all questions. I don't know the answers. Maybe the Russian plan, on the contrary, is to continue with this very incremental war, which they have been waging up to now, and which, to be clear, has on balance been working for them. But some of the comments that have been made by Russian officials, including Putin himself, I would suggest do not argue against the first hypothesis that a major Russian offensive, a really big Second World War style Russian offensive, might be in the works, might now be coming. Anyway, let me finish by briefly discussing the situation on the front lines. The Russian advances in Zaporozhye region continue. The Russians have produced footage of their troops capturing clusters of Ukrainian troops west of Gulyapolye. There are reports that an entire Ukrainian brigade there is disintegrating. We'll see. My own view is that the battle for Orekhov is probably no more than a few weeks away at most, and I believe, based on what Russian officials are themselves saying, that the siege of the city of Zaporozhye is shortly going to begin, and that General Teplinsky's forces south of Zaporozhye city are primarily targeting the city of Zaporozhye, not Orekhov itself, as many believe. Meanwhile, the Russians have consolidated their positions in Dnipropetrovsk region, and there is apparently a major battle going on for control of the western approaches to Konstantinovka. There's a battle specifically for a village, which is really a suburb of Konstantinovka, called Ilinka. And it's been suggested that if the Russians capture Ilinka, which of course they will, then at that point Konstantinovka's position will collapse and the defense of that city will end. And, well, the Russians also seem to be pressing forward hard in Liman, in the area of the town of Liman, and east of Slavyansk. They seem to be moving westwards from Siversk, but also from other places, and it does increasingly look as if the city of the village of Raya Alexandrovka is now directly threatened. And the Russians are also increasingly active in the north of Kharkiv and Sumy regions in a way that nobody seems to fully understand. But if a big offensive is being prepared, given the focus of the missile and drone attacks on Kiev and the blackout of Kiev, could it be, might it be, that Kiev itself, along with Odessa, where, as I said, the blackout is also very bad, could be a potential target? Anyway, we will no doubt find out in due course, but this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, X, and Substack. Please remember that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.